Hello, my name is Jeremiah Almiral, and this is my group mates Cheyenne and Elise, and our presentation about the psychology of moral conviction. I'm passing over to Cheyenne.
Thank you, Jeremiah. I will begin with some background information, essentialism versus subjectivism. Researchers often imply that morality is an inherent property of some issues, situations, choices, attitudes, and judgments. The moral conviction approach allows participants to define the degree to which their thoughts, feelings, and beliefs reflect something moral. Social domain theory. The idea that people can access and report on moral concerns is supported by social domain theory and by research on people's ability to distinguish between preferences, normative conventions, and moral concerns. People, even children as young as 39 months of age, can reliably access conceptions of morality and can distinguish those conceptions from both preferences and normative conventions. Moving on, we also argue that morality is a matter of degree rather than strictly a matter of kind. For example, attitudes towards smoking have changed from being a matter of preference to being increasingly moralized over the last 50 to 60 years. Another example of moral significance is that restrictions on abortion in the United States were not initially grounded in concerns about morality, but were rooted in medical and healthcare concerns. At this point, I will now turn the presentation back over to Jeremiah.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Focus or review. According to the domain theory of attitudes, people tend to perceive moral attitudes as objectively and universally true, independent of authority and resistant to alterations. As a result of social pressures, additionally, people tend to display an intense intolerance to those who reject or disobey their morally convicted attitudes. Moving forward. Methodology. This study was performed using a technique known as meta-analysis. The reviewers used the participants and results of many previous studies in order to gain a vast amount of data to analyze. Moral conviction was measured in studies using mostly self-reporting techniques, and using indirect measures such as self-reporting makes defining moral convictions more difficult. In order to minimize confounding variables, the researchers only selected studies with specifically measured the degree to which an attitude aligns with a person's moral values. Continuing on with methodology, the researchers tested the below four suppositions based on the domain theory of attitudes. In the left column, we have perceived objectivity and universality, morally convicted attitudes perceived as true facts, and people generally perceive their attitudes as truths that apply universally. We also have means versus ends, and on the right column, authority and pure independence, and obligation and motivation. And passing it over to Cheyenne.
Thank you, Jeremiah. I will continue on with an overview of findings. For perceived objectivity and universality, results support the hypothesis that attitudes high in moral conviction are perceived much like facts and universals, something that distinguishes them from attitudes that might otherwise be perceived as strong but not moral. Authority and pure independence. Moral convictions appear to inoculate people from pressures that usually lead them to defer to authorities, to the rule of law, or to the pressures of normative or majority influence. Means versus ends. Research finds that people are tolerant of nearly any means, including lying and violence, so long as they achieve morally preferred ends. Obligation and motivation. The motivational potency of moral conviction appears to be explained by a sense of obligation to act in the name of one's moral beliefs, something people are also willing to project onto others. Political engagement. Research finds that moral conviction predicts political engagement. Stronger moral convictions about a given cause are associated with increased political activism. Intolerance. Higher levels of moral conviction predict intolerance of those with opposing beliefs. However, This was found to be weaker when people used their cognition to evaluate the problem. This suggests that political intolerance is mostly an automatic and unconscious process, and willingness to compromise. Research findings indicate that the stronger one's moral convictions are about an issue, the less likely they will be willing to compromise on an issue. I will now turn the presentation over to Elise.
Thank you. So let's talk about a few more review findings. So what does this study show us about the relationship between moral conviction and emotion? Well, this shows us that these two concepts are very closely tied together. The question is, do moral convictions influence emotion, or does emotion influence moral conviction? We have a chicken and an egg incident here. Well, the answer to this question is both. This research shows that emotion is the root of moral conviction, but it can also be a response to moral convictions. So, how exactly do attitudes become moralized or demoralized? Well, the authors of this study suggest using the domain model of attitude moralization, which asserts that the result of attitude moralization depends on a person's initial attitude towards an issue. This initial attitude can result in a response of either moral recognition or moral amplification. Now, moral recognition occurs when a person's initial attitude is thought of as just a preference or a mindless habit. During this process, a person reflects on the issue and decides whether or not the position they initially came in with is actually aligns with their moral convictions. In this way, they recognize what their moral convictions are on the issue. So, for example, because I know a lot of you are residents of Southern California, let's just say that I was a fan of the LA Dodgers, but only because my favorite color was blue. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe supporting my local team, the San Francisco Giants, might be a morally better choice for me because I feel that I have an inherent sense of loyalty. So in this way, I recognize how I felt about the morality of the issue. Now, moral amplification occurs when a person moralizes conventional or weak attitudes, and as a result, that attitude becomes highly moralized. There's not as much cognitive effort in this process as in moral recognition, because people come into it with the general idea about how they feel about the morality of the issue. So, for example, because I'm a Bay Area resident, I am a fan of the Giants because I think it's kind of obligatory where I live, and I kind of like them. I don't have anything against them. But after thinking about it, I realized my loyalty is actually more important to me than I thought. And so now I feel like I need to support the Giants even more to display that. So in this way, my morality was amplified. Now, demoralization is the process of altering attitudes that are already high in moral conviction. And this is a very difficult thing to do. There hasn't been a whole lot of research in this area, but after an initial review, it appears that demoralization may occur when people are presented with information that moralizes opposing views on an issue. So, for example, if I was a fan of the Giants and I was presented with data that showed me that the Dodgers were rescuing orphan babies and donating millions of dollars to charity, I might just forget about my loyalty to the Giants and move over to the Dodgers bandwagon, which I'm sure many of you would be happy if I did. So, the conclusion of this study, this review initially predicted that moral convictions would align well with the domain theory of attitudes, and this is true. So, to recap, the domain theory asserts that moral convictions differ psychologically from conventional beliefs and attitudes. So, in agreement with this theory, moral convictions were found to be heavily rooted in emotion and perceived as objectively and universally true, self-justified, and independent of outside influence. Now, this is exactly the opposite of how conventional beliefs operate, because they're not emotionally driven and they are subject to outside influence. So, this study gives us empirical support for the domain theory of attitudes. Now, let's move on to implications. The study of moral convictions presents many interesting avenues for future research. We could look at how moral convictions develop over someone's life, from childhood to adulthood, how moral convictions might change over time, what are the psychological functions involved with moral convictions. We definitely need more research in the area of moralization and demoralization, and how would this affect people's political beliefs and behavior? So how does this apply today, you might ask? Well, we could use this data to figure out how we might decrease some of the polarization in our society by eliminating negative effects of moral convictions, like unwillingness to compromise, intolerance, and inability to reach a consensus. So, in my opinion, studying moral convictions has never been more relevant than it is today. All of us feel like we're morally in the right on everything we believe in, and of course, this causes all sorts of problems, especially in our political climate. So, better understanding moral convictions could perhaps reveal a way for us to lessen the negative effects of moral convictions, like intolerance and unwillingness to compromise. Can you imagine what our society would be capable of if we could do that? This concludes our presentation. On behalf of my group, I would like to thank you for watching and have a great day.